Good morning, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar today. This is the third in a series of 4 webinars that are taking place during March on the topic of offshore wind in nature. And these webinars are organized by BirdLife Europe with the support of the Renewables Grid Initiative, the North Sea Foundation, and Nature and Milieu. I'm Daniel Mitchell, and I'm the Marine Manager at BirdLife Europe and Central Asia. So we have an exciting lineup of presentations for you today. Our first session will be on offshore wind farm tenders and auctions, and we'll be exploring the benefits and limitations of non-price tendered criteria for nature. We'll then have a break at around 11, and this will be followed by a session on nature inclusive design and co-use of offshore wind farms. Before we kick off, just a few housekeeping rules. So firstly, if you can please keep yourself on mute. Secondly, if you'd like to ask a question or make an intervention, you can use the raise the hand function. And we ask that you use your video camera if possible when making an intervention or asking a question. And lastly, the chat function is open, so please feel free to use this during the webinar. And lastly, just to say that we are recording this webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Vasilios Anatolitis. Sorry, I thought I would pronounce it well, but I didn't. Who's going to be talking to us about tender and auction processes for offshore wind farms. So Vasily, please take it away and share your slides.
Of course, thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's great to be here. Really good opportunity to share my knowledge and get some knowledge from your side. So I hope you can see my presentation in full mode. No objections to that. Perfect. So basically today I'm going to talk about non-price criteria in offshore wind auctions, if it's actually a good fit. As I said, my name is Vasilios Anatolitis. My background, I'm an economist. I've been a researcher at Fraunhofer ISI in beautiful Karlsruhe, Germany for more than 6 years. I've just submitted my PhD with the title Support Cost Efficiency of Renewable Energy Auctions and Empirical Design Analysis. And as you can see, with my research interests, one of the main topics are renewable energy support schemes and especially auctions. So before I get into the content of my presentation, just a small disclaimer. I kept it quite simple, very basic, just to give you an idea what are offshore wind auctions and auctions, renewable energy auctions in general. And I'm digging a little bit deeper into the non-price criteria, the multi-criteria auction process. And then the next presentations will dig more into what this non-price criteria have to do with nature and how they can be combined. And if you have, so basically my presentation is more on a basic level. If you have more further questions, we can, I'm happy to answer them in the Q&A session, or you can drop me an email afterwards. But without further ado, first of all, what are renewable energy auctions and how did they become the predominant support instrument for renewable energy sources? So most of you, I guess, know that renewable energies were in the past and still more expensive than other sources of electricity, especially the fossil fuel-based ones. And therefore, they needed support, and they still need support by the government, monetary support. So in the past, we had these administratively set feed-in tariffs, meaning the government said, look, guys, I'll give you a certain amount of money, and you just need to produce electricity. You know, you might have a neighbor who has a PV power plant on his roof, and they just needed to produce electricity, and they got the money. Then the government saw, okay, well, there are some issues with it. People are not really reacting to prices. They're just producing electricity, and that's a little bit of an issue for our electricity system. That's why the government then said, okay, look, I promise you still a certain amount of money for the electricity you produce, but you need to sell your electricity at the market. And if it's not enough, you'll get a little bit on top from me. You'll get in overall this the sum of money I promised you, but you still need to become active. this still had some issues because the project developers just built their projects and they knew, I will get this amount of money. And the government doesn't know, is it too much? Is it too little money? They just had to try their best. And that's why the government had the idea, well, why should we tell the project developers how much money they get for the renewable electricity? They should come to us and tell us how much they need. And this was how renewable energy auctions have been implemented. This had, of course, a positive impact for the market integration of renewable energies. So with the administratively set feed-in tariffs, there was almost no market integration because people just produce, didn't have to care about anything. And with renewable energy auctions, this is quite the opposite. Nevertheless, with the administratively set feed-in tariffs, there was a lot of investor security. You just need to build your plant and you didn't have any risk besides the technical risk. The difference with renewable energy auctions is you don't even know. You might have a very good idea of building a power plant, but you don't know if you even get any support. So what are those renewable energy auctions? It's a market-based mechanism to allocate the support by the government to renewable energy producers. Usually we have one auctioneer and many bidders, so many project developers. Usually the auctioneer is the government. And the government then says, okay, there's a certain auction volume. To give you an example, I want to support 5 offshore wind power plants. Or for example, I want to support 200 megawatt of PV power projects. And then the bidders come, they submit their project proposals and how much money they actually need to realize the project. And then the auctioneer takes all those different bids and starts awarding the lowest bid until the auction volume is reached. So the lowest, the auctioneer ranks all of the bids, and then the cheapest ones gets awarded until the auction volume is reached. What are the advantages of using auctions? So in the past, when I mentioned these administratively set support schemes, the problem was that there wasn't really any volume. So in certain countries, Spain, Greece, for example, or even in Germany, a lot of projects went online, were realized. And this led to really increasing support costs for the government, because the government didn't have any control of the actual volumes that are going to be built. And by using auctions, the government can actually decide how much volume should be supported and be built. Another advantage is the low support costs. Of course, if the bidders need to say how much money they need, this tends to reduce the support cost. Plus, with the increased competition in the auctions, the bidders try to make their project as cost efficient as possible. Of course, with all the advantages, there come some disadvantages, some challenges. So first of all, auctions, renewable energy auctions have an issue with actor diversity, meaning smaller bidders, smaller project developers have an issue participating in the auctions. They tend to have higher cost projects. They can't bear the risk. And in the past, for example, in Germany, a lot of community-led projects went online that deteriorated due to the introduction of renewable energy auctions. The other challenge is if there is enough competition, meaning there are plenty of bidders participating in the auction, then auctions work usually perfectly fine. As soon as there is no competition in the auction, you have a very big problem as an auctioneer, because the bidders can actually submit any price they want, and they know there is still going to be awarded, because all the participating bidders are awarded if there's no competition. And last but not least, another challenge is we've seen it in the UK and in Ireland in the late 90s, beginning of 2000s. The problem is if projects are awarded, they have quite a lot of time, of course, to be realized. If they're not realized in the end, the governments might miss their renewable energy targets that they set themselves. So the realization rate is quite a big challenge in renewable energy auctions. So how does such an offshore wind, we're talking about offshore wind here, offshore wind auctions, how does it work in practice? I'm showing you here one example, or rather two examples, for one of the most intuitive design elements, meaning the single unit auction and the multi-unit auction. How does a single unit auction look like? For example, this is what's happening in the Netherlands or in Denmark or in Germany. So basically the government says, I want to support the erection of a 900 megawatt offshore wind park in the North Sea. Then we have here 4 bidders, and they are all submitting a certain bid price. And say, for example, bidder 1 says, I'm going to build the park for 130 euros per megawatt hour. The second one says 100. The third one, 150, a little bit more expensive. And the third one in between with 120 euros per megawatt hour. So then the auctioneer, the government, looks at the prices and says, well, who's the cheapest one? Of course, bidder 2 with 100 euros per megawatt hour. So this bidder gets the right to build the offshore wind park and gets as a support or as a remuneration 100 euros per megawatt hour. How does it look like in multi-unit auctions? Again, we have the auctioneer, we have the 4 bidders, but in this case, the auctioneer says, I want to support 1,400 megawatt of offshore wind park capacity, meaning I don't really care where the offshore wind parks are or how big they are. Let's see how much you're going to propose. So in contrast to the single unit auction, the bidders not only submit a certain bid price, but a capacity as well. So bidder 1 says, I will erect a 400 megawatt park for 100 euros per megawatt hour. The second one, 150 euros for 200 megawatt. Third one, 145 with 300 megawatt. And last but not least, a big offshore wind park with 1000 megawatt for 90 euros per megawatt hour. Again, the government looks at the prices. Okay, the cheapest one is bidder 4. So they're getting awarded for 1000 megawatt hours. So meaning they get the award, they get the support. Then the next price, the next submitted bid, 100 euros per megawatt hour for 400 megawatt. The auctioneer checks, okay, is there still enough capacity that I want to support? Of course, right now we are at 1,400 megawatt hour. So the auction volume is reached. So theoretically, bidder 3 would be awarded, is the next who should be awarded, but there is no more capacity left, auction volume left. So this was a nice example, I guess, how it worked in the past, or let's say in the recent past. So the focus of renewable energy auctions was mostly on the objective of achieving low support costs, low support levels, the so-called static efficiency for those among of you who've already dealt with renewable energy auctions and policy objectives. So again, the focus was really, let's get the lowest price possible. These market-based approaches went with limited governmental intervention. So the government just said, okay, we just want to reduce the cost. Let us know what, and as long as we achieve our renewable energy targets, we don't care about anything. So auctions with price-only selection made most sense. So in the past, looking at the offshore wind auctions, the auctions were used to allocate support for unprofitable renewable energy projects, but we see more and more projects, as you can see with the average awarded price. These are all offshore wind auctions. So in 2012-15, we had quite high prices. But in the past couple of years, as you can see here, we are at 0, meaning the projects, at least in the offshore wind realm, have become profitable, really with only getting the revenues from the market. Meaning we see more and more 0 price bids, and the auctions have become an instrument to allocate the right to realize an already profitable project. The problem is, if you remember the 4 bidders, what happens if all 4 bidders submit a price of 0? The easiest way, which has really happened in certain cases, is to have a lottery then. And then you choose by randomly one of these bidders. From an economics perspective, doesn't make too much sense, because maybe somebody has so much revenues They could even pay you for building the offshore wind park. And one idea to, instead of throwing a coin or selecting randomly the awarded bidder, the winner of the auction, is to use non-price criteria in offshore wind auctions. And this has, for example, happened in the Netherlands. We introduced that in Germany, and it's actually under consideration in the UK. Meaning, we have achieved these low support levels, meaning the zero price bids. So we start from a practical perspective just to differentiate the projects, but as well, this allows us to have to put more focus on secondary objectives in the auction. As I mentioned in the beginning, it was more about achieving low awarded prices. Now, for example, resilience, industrial development, the environment become more important. COVID-19 pandemic, war in Ukraine, and the governments start playing a more active role in the auction procedures. So we see more and more auctions with multi-criteria, non-price criteria selection procedures. They've started emerging. So how does this look like from a little bit more technical perspective? So besides the bid price, other non-price criteria are taken into consideration for the award procedure. So meaning, if you remember this, the little figure with the different bidders, meaning that not necessarily the bidder with the lowest price is awarded, but maybe the second highest or the second lowest price, but the project is better in terms of these other objectives. So multi-criteria selection allows the auctioneer to consider further objectives, for example, environmental protection or industrial development. This enables differentiating between zero price bids and incorporating these further objectives in the selection. Nevertheless, we only have few experience in the renewable energy sector as a whole with in Europe with these multi-criteria selection. For example, France has a long-standing experience, to some extent Italy, the Netherlands, and soon Germany. So from the design perspective, all criteria need to be translated into quantitative scores to make criteria and projects comparable. So you could you have like, for example, for the price, you can achieve 100 points. For the other criteria as well, 100 points, and then you need to weight these scores. There are some pitfalls. If you're interested in these nitty-gritty details, I'm happy to discuss them later on. What to do with the bid price? So traditionally, you just take the strike price of a sliding feed-in premium, a contract for difference as a bid price. As I said, this 100 euro per megawatt hour. Nevertheless, and then you need to weight it with the other objectives. In Europe, you need to remember this price needs to be at least 70%, and 30% are allowed for the other criteria. So it's still under the state aid rules, it's still the focus is on the bid price. Nevertheless, as in the case of the Netherlands, you can just say, well, guys, we won't give you any support payments anymore. You need to get the revenue from the market. So the zero price bid is fixed. Or you can even go further. I think in the Netherlands, you've started doing that as well, to say, okay, you don't get any support. We look at all the other objectives, but you need to pay us. You need to suggest a certain payment to really realize the project. What are the advantages? Of course, you can achieve further objectives besides achieving a low price, and you can differentiate between the zero price bids. The problem with the multi-selection procedure is that not necessarily the cheapest project is realized. This usually leads to higher support expenditures. There's always this trade-off between more further objectives and, of course, lower support payments. This multi-selection criteria can be perceived as complex or non-transparent. And it's difficult to actually value the non-price criteria against the price, meaning how much more am I willing to pay for a little bit better project in terms of this other criteria. And the lowest score can be used as a pre-qualification requirement to say, look, you need to achieve a certain amount of this other further objectives. Which brings me to my next point. There is an inherent difference between qualification criteria and scoring criteria, because in some instances, policymakers said, oh, well, let's include the scoring criteria and ask for the more, and the more experienced the bidder is, we should give them more points. But from my and our point of view, this doesn't make sense. There's a difference between the ensuring the capability of a bidder to build the project, which should go into qualification criteria. So you don't allow anybody to participate in the auctions. They need to fulfill certain criteria and exploit a higher performance of the projects, which should go under scoring. For example, qualification criteria, the experience with previous projects, or the financial capability of the bidder. And for scoring is the lower price or additional values. For example, a project that really develops the industry, the local industry. To give you some examples, pre-qualification requirements can be material pre-qualification, usually some permits you need to show. Financial pre-qualification are bank guarantees, and bidder restrictions is like the experience with similar projects, for example. The presentation is going to be sent around, so I won't go into detail, just to give you some examples here. You can read them up if you're interested. On the other hand, the scoring criteria can be project-related, for example, installed capacity, bidder-related, financial risks, balance sheets, environmental or economic impact. And since we are talking here about nature, some examples. For example, all the environmental permits and environmental impact assessment should be rather a pre-qualification requirement if it's important for the auctioneer. So not as a scoring criteria. No, you need to show it, then you can participate in the auction. On the other hand, the number of wind turbines can be a scoring criteria. So the fewer wind turbines you use, the less impact on the environment, the better. Or the occupied area, or some innovative solutions. I think we are going, this is one of the main topics today. Or a budget for environmental measures or impact on the environment can be used as a scoring criteria as well. So coming to the conclusions, so auctions can hardly create a market, they merely exploit the market to achieve an efficient allocation and price discovery. There are different objectives that auctioneers and the government has that can counteract each other, and they require actually different auction designs. One key message is that auctions perform best when kept simple. Pre-qualification is best for issues related to really ensuring the capability of bidders to realize this offshore wind project. This multi-criteria scoring systems that can help exploiting higher performance based on further policy objectives, apart from lowest cost only. One idea we had is to have separate auctions to reach additional policy objectives and at the same time maintain simplicity, meaning to have one price only normal auctions, because it's still important to have low prices, and multi-criteria innovation auctions. This refers rather to the overall renewable energy landscape and not so much on offshore wind, where we saw the zero price bids. And there is actually this inherent difference between delivering the lowest price and unleashing creativity for innovation and unconventional solutions. So you need to design it very, very carefully to have both in us at the same time in a fair competition. And one important aspect is that multi-criteria auctions are a relatively new phenomenon in the renewable energy landscape. So more data and experience needed for a final verdict. So thank you very much. Yeah, I'm open to questions, remarks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vasily. It was a really interesting presentation and a really good overview of the tender process and how this has developed over the years. We're going to have a question and answer session after the next presentation. So if you have questions, please hold them for the time being. And next up, we will have a presentation on the benefits and limitations of non-price tender criteria for nature. And we have a small change to the speaker. We will have Eline van Onselen, who is an ecologist at the North Sea Foundation, standing in for her colleague Christian, who was meant to be speaking. So Eline, I pass the floor to you.
Thank you very much. Yes, so welcome everyone. My name is Eline van Onselen. I'm a marine ecologist. As Daniel said, I will be replacing my colleague Christian today, who is unfortunately ill at home. So please bear with me. Don't pin me down on any specifics, but feel free to ask questions, and let's have a nice discussion afterwards. Also, thanks to Vasilios for having such a nice introduction to the tendering procedure. And I will go today a little bit into the benefits and the limitation of ecological tender criteria. But first we have to go back a little bit and zoom out a little bit and look at offshore wind on itself. As we have already heard in other webinars, and what you probably know is that offshore wind both has risks and opportunities for nature. The risks are on the side of negative effects such as underwater noise, habitat loss, avoidance, and other things. Opportunities are mostly underwater, such as refuge area, a species you would like to see back, so more of a restoration, habitat gain, food increase, and things like that. And this picture is something we always have to keep in mind when building in an offshore area. Just to give a little bit of a recap of what Christian told us in an earlier webinar. Maybe you were there, maybe you were not, so I'll just go through it quickly. We like to use the mitigation hierarchy. And the mitigation hierarchy has 4 steps, which is avoiding, mitigating, restoring, and offsetting. Where in the first one, avoiding, you would want no impact at all. And in the last one, you would want a positive impact. And when looking at tender criteria, it would be very nice to actually embed this mitigation hierarchy into the criteria to really develop a method that is useful for the entire ecosystem. Because, of course, this is what we want. We're working in degraded systems. We already have a lot of human activities, but we actually want less impact. And we want healthy ecosystems, of course. To have less impact, we use the first 2 of the mitigation hierarchy, which is preventing and mitigating. And to really give a boost to the system, we also want to restore and offset our effects. So the tendering system right now is quite nationally driven. Procedures can differ between countries, but what is the same between countries is that it always creates a certain competition. However, it also creates quite a nice level playing field. Everyone has a chance to bid, and also because the criteria can be non-price criteria, this can really drive innovation. And this is for nature quite an important one, because innovation is needed, speed is needed. And if somehow we can drive innovation to really support nature enhancement, this is really a win already. So ecological non-price criteria, which is quite specific, because non-price criteria can, of course, be anything you would want it to be. But if we focus on ecology, it's quite nice to use tendering criteria to steer towards specific targets. Of course, it's very important here to know what you want to strive towards. So it's very important to have a clear vision of what you want to accomplish. And then you can award points to what you see as most important. Usually these are practical applications. So it can be nature enhancement on your assets, so on your wind farm, on your turbine, on your foundations or your scar protection, or maybe even on the cable crossings, for example. And this also really depends on national legislation and what parts of your wind farm actually fall into the tendering procedure, because this differs as well between countries. It's a really nice way to stimulate nature enhancement, including nature-inclusive designs. And it's as I was already saying before, it's a really nice way to stimulate innovation. So this can be nature enhancement. Really practical examples are, for example, placing artificial reefs or outplacing organic material. But it can also be monitoring equipment or monitoring techniques. Or it can even be thinking about decommissioning already. Because if we create something for nature, we don't want to remove it again, of course. And by putting it into your non-price criteria, this can really drive innovation towards something that works both for the industry and for ecology. And of course, it really helps to contribute to international goals. And this can be either goals, for example, goals we have in Natura 2000, or other offshore ecological goals that we have to really put together the industry and nature. And the first example that we have, of course, was Hollandse Kust West 6 in the Netherlands, which I will talk about just a little bit later on. So how can we put the mitigation hierarchy really into the tender criteria? I actually split the hierarchy into two. So the first ones, avoiding and mitigating, are really about lessening the effect. And this is quite hard to put into your tender criteria, because most of the time, avoidance, such as placing your wind farm in a certain area, or maybe using a certain technique at a certain time of year, or not using it, and mitigation as well. For example, lowering your sound levels while pile driving. These are already embedded in national legislation, sometimes even international legislation. So only if you go extra legal, so above what's already put into national legislation, this could be useful to put into tender criteria. It makes it a little bit difficult because you're already speaking about something that's already embedded. The other two, however, they give a really nice opportunity for the tender criteria. Restoration, I also put rehabilitation in there because it's not exactly the same. Restoration is returning the area to an original state. And rehabilitation is more about restoring basic ecological function. So it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly the same as it was before. And this is a really nice one because we can really build on what's there and what could be there. And really say, okay, the wind farm is going to be there, but how can we make use of the structures, of the functions, and how can we build on that to make it even better? And then the last one, offsetting, again, is quite a difficult one, because with offsetting, you want to compensate for any residual effects that are still left after implementing the first three parts of the mitigation hierarchy. And offsetting can be quite difficult, especially above water, but underwater as well. And here you really have to look outside of the box, think outside of the box. And to put this in your tender criteria can be quite difficult because sometimes you have to look outside of your wind farm as well. And again, if that's possible in national legislation, then it's great, but sometimes it can be quite difficult. In the Netherlands, for example, in the tender bid, it's really just your wind farm itself, the wind farm structures, and even putting something in between your turbines already falls out of the tendering procedure. So it can be quite difficult to go there. However, there are, of course, benefits of using ecological tender criteria. It's quite an easy way to put big money towards nature enhancement. If you have this little push for bids to go towards nature enhancement, well, it creates competition. And if you have competition, then that's where money really starts to roll. Again, this push for innovation is really important, and we really see new things coming up. And of course, the data that is gathered during this whole process can also be used for other purposes. And especially as an NGO that's really science-based, we really like to see that data is shared and used for other purposes. This whole procedure is quite fast, and it's actually a lot faster than when you want to change national regulation or law. Speed is really what we need right now, because the outroll of offshore wind is incredibly fast. We haven't seen the likes of it before. So this is really a way for us as NGOs to step on board. Another benefit is that it can have really specific measures on the location. Of course, the bids are location specific because all the areas are auctioned separately. And it's a really nice way to look at your area and really see, okay, what's possible here? How can we make it even better than it already is? And lastly, of course, it creates really nice opportunities for collaboration between NGOs and the industry, which is quite a unique combination, of course, but also for science and industry to work together, for example. And this also really depends on the specific criteria and how you want to, where you want to steer towards. Unfortunately, of course, there's also quite a lot of limitations to non-price criteria. And the first one I already mentioned is that it's quite often limited to assets and the direct surroundings, while it would be nice to have more of a holistic view. Also, during the bidding process, it's quite difficult to get knowledge sharing on the road. Because the consortia, of course, compete with each other, and they do not want to share the greatest ideas because, of course, they want to win it themselves. As I was saying, the holistic approach might be limited, and this is not only an area effect, so because you're only working in your wind farm, but it could also be limited because instead of having a certain amount you would pay, for example, you only look at your own wind farm. And this also makes it really difficult to look at easy ways to scale up. And this is also my next point. It's pioneering versus upscaling. We are pioneering right now. We're trying new things and we're learning from that. But that makes it sometimes difficult to go well, bigger scale. National rules differ between countries. So it can be that, for example, on one side of the border, well, bottom fisheries are still allowed, for example, while on the other side they're not. And this can also really affect both your criteria as well as the effects in the end. Someone has to value the criteria, give it a value. And this, of course, is quite subjective and can also be quite difficult. Who will decide what it's worth, what nature is worth, and in what area nature is worth and why? So this is also quite a limitation to this type of working. And lastly, offsetting, as I was talking about before, it's needed, especially for birds, but especially for birds it's also really, really hard. We really don't know how yet, if it's even possible. So how can you even then put it in your criteria? We need to learn, and we need to learn fast. And the last point I put on here is more of a question for the room. I think, do we need ecological tenders for the nature transition? It's fast, and that is really something that works in our benefit. But would it be better if, for example, everyone would just pay a flat levy instead of putting it into your tendering procedure. And that's also a question I would like to discuss later on. So in practice in the Netherlands, we've had our first ecological tender, as we call it, the Hollandse Kust West. And the second one, the IJmuidenver, is currently in the making. And we also see that other countries such as Belgium, France, and Germany, they're using or considering non-price criteria. So it's really going up. Some last messages I want to give you all, especially as an NGO. We think that it's very important to keep on approaching industry and ministries and keep on, giving out the message. Ecology is important, nature is important, and the energy transition can only be a success if the nature transition rolls out along beside it. We think that the mitigation hierarchy should be used in the right order. But don't forget about the last one. Don't forget about offsetting. And also don't forget about extra legal measures. So if we look at national legislation and mitigation and avoidance, don't forget you can actually take that extra step and go a little bit further. Learn from each other. We have, of course, the ocean group where we can share information, share knowledge, the coalition, by learning from each other. And it's also very important to really look over your border. So look at sea basins as a whole. A holistic approach is always better than looking at your own little postmark. And lastly, we really see that the wind industry wants to be nature positive. There's a huge drive right now, and we can really help them to give this more body, to say, okay, let's go in this direction, let's do it together, let's share our knowledge, and let's make the world a little bit better. That's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eline. It was a really nice presentation, and I think some really interesting questions that you raised during it. So we now have an opportunity for question and answers and discussions. So I open it up to the floor. If you have a question, please use the raise the hand function. As there are no questions for the time being, maybe I can start with one. So my question is about interventions for nature that are outside of your offshore wind farm site or not on your offshore wind farm structures, and kind of the feasibility around this, both for tenderers, so responding to these kind of more complex criteria, but also for governments for assessing these criteria, because when you open it up, you're likely to get very diverse types of interventions proposed by tenderers. So how do you compare those in a fair way? And I suppose opening this up a bit more, then Eline, you were talking about the sea basin level, and I assume it then gets even more complicated if you're talking about a wind farm in the waters of one country and maybe an intervention that could be best done in the waters of another country. And yeah, just something that struck me, Vasily, in one of your final slides, you mentioned simple auctions are better. So yeah, just your thoughts on these points I raised.
Please go ahead, Eline.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I just wanted to say, Daniel, it's a really good point, and I don't have an answer yet. I think we should look into it together as NGOs, but also ministries and especially the industry, because I think there are options. What's really important, I think, is to really have a clear vision of where we want to go. And that's not there yet. So it makes it even more difficult to say, okay, let's put it into tender criteria. So we we just have no we have no vision, not a clear vision, and not a specific one. So we should really go for that, and then say, okay, now we can put it into a tendering procedure, which makes it even more difficult because we have no time, and the rollout is so fast, and we want to, keep on going. So it's also a learning by doing experience, I think. We have to try things and see if it works, and if it doesn't, at least we tried. Yeah, so I think we would have to go that way, and it's difficult, and I don't think we have all the answers yet, but I think if we have a little bit of an adjustive or how do you say that? We call it a hand on the tap sort of experience where you can adjust where needed. I think that's the way to go right now. What do you think, Vasilios?
Yeah, looking at it a little bit more from the auction perspective, economist perspective, I think it's always a little bit of a trade-off. That's a problem. You can make it simple and say, for example, yeah, the bidder with the most budget for environmental actions. I don't know what. I'm not an expert on that. You are the experts here. And the bidder with the most budget for these kind of actions gets the most points. The problem is always I can imagine it might be some kind of greenwashing. That's a problem. Like the easiest things, and we'll put a lot of money in that. As far as I know, the industry, it will look something like that. The other option is just from a very technical perspective to have. I think you're doing this with the in the Netherlands with this innovation criterion. You have there is a kind of board with innovation scholars, experts, and something like that would be possible to say, look, there is a committee of NGOs, experts, and you're sitting there and say, look, okay, this really makes sense. You'll get most points, and the other one who's just greenwashing, no points at all. But again, you have the problem of, okay, then it becomes a little bit non-transparent. It becomes a little bit more complex. And yeah, but I completely agree. First of all, you need to know what you actually want, and you are the experts on that. And if you say, okay, this really needs to be done because otherwise the ecosystem goes to hell, yeah, then it shouldn't be a scoring criterion, but it should be either extra legal or in the legal framework or as a pre-qualification criterion. Like that's just my 2 cents on that. Like,
thank you both of you, and sorry for the difficult question. David.
Hi, thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Vasilios and Eline. I have a question. I'm based in Spain, but working at a European scale with BirdLife and looking at especially at the offshore development of the renewable sector. And as you probably know, in the Mediterranean, we're just starting to come onto the stage with floating offshore now becoming economically viable, now economically viable, and the regulatory regimes and the spatial plans are all coming forward, so that we expect big changes this decade, as we need to see. So the question of thinking about how we structure this and how we design this is there's nothing been done here yet, so the learning curve is elsewhere. We need probably a massive investment in ports for all of the services that are needed to get the infrastructure out there, especially floating infrastructure. What might that mean for a good auction design in terms of the price criteria and the non-price criteria? I'm bearing in mind that because this is a new sector in the sea, in the Mediterranean, we're not really sure. We might have some reasonable ideas about some of the risks for biodiversity, for example, and hence some of the priorities. But there are also huge uncertainties because we haven't studied the interactions. In the North and Baltic Seas, you've been through some of this, especially with fixed offshore. So I wonder whether you might be able to give us some thoughts on those points. Thanks.
Yeah, maybe Eline start with the environmental aspects, and then I can take over the.
Yeah. About the economics, I really can't can't answer your question. I think you already answered your question a little bit yourself. You really have to look at other sea basins to learn from each other, of course we have modeling. There's nothing we know about the Mediterranean as well, and I think we have to be very critical in judging what would be good for the environment and what wouldn't. Of course, there's all types of national procedures that a wind farm has to go through before it even becomes a bid. And I think that's of course very important. We need the environmental assessments and things like that before it can be placed. And I think most of those assessments are already quite critical, so that's good. And I think we can use the tendering procedure to go that step further. Of course, the tendering procedure is very area specific, and there's already information before you even get a green light to build your wind farm. And you can use that information to go that step beyond and say, okay, well, we have all these specific, we know the parameters, we know the biotic and the abiotic characteristics of the area. We know if the status is good or bad, or maybe there's a certain habitat we would want to enhance, or maybe a certain species you would want to focus on. And I think then it can be quite specific, and it can also be quite positive to go into that direction. Of course, we don't have all the answers, and we don't know if everything will work or not. And I think that is just a risk we will have to be taking, because we don't have the time to first do it on a small scale. We really have to take a giant leap and go for it on a large scale and see if it works. And if it doesn't, well, yeah, that's going to be quite bad. But if it does work, then well, we have made some progress. But it is definitely a difficult situation.
No, just a small comment on that. No, thank you. Thanks a lot. I see all these points that Eline mentioned rather outside of the actual tender specifications. Like I rather see that as regulatory, because it seems to have an impact if you build the whole supply chain, the ports, and so on and so forth. I rather see that not as a tender criterion, but rather regulatory. Can you build it or not? Are you allowed to build it? Environmental impact assessments, and so on and so on and so forth. And I see rather the risk here, not so much, or there might be some issues with the environment, but if you don't have the supply chain in place, you might have difficulties to actually build your offshore wind farm. I would be more afraid in the Spanish case about that. I know the example from the UK with the supply chain plan, meaning if you want to build or participate in the auction, you need to show that you at least thought about all the critical issues about the supply chain. Can you really do that? So what I've shown with the scoring criteria and the capability, the qualification requirements, I would very, very, very much see it rather on this qualification requirements and not, or you can do it a little bit better than the other. No, it's, can you do it or not? Like, is there a supply chain in place? And if not, how can you actually ensure to be able to build it? And then if you can show this, this already should include the whole environmental impact assessment and so on and so forth for the supply chain. For the actual offshore wind farm, that's another topic to discuss. Again, I would just like to stress the point. I see there is a big difference, and everybody should be clear about what is really important to have, what is really detrimental for the environment, which should go into the qualification criteria, and what is nice to have, which makes it better, which makes it a little bit more less of an impact. But if it's if it happens, it's not that detrimental and all the fish die. I don't know the exact impacts, but I hope you get my point. Like, I think you need to be clear about these things, and to give you this as a suggestion to think about this and give recommendations on that, because policymakers, economists, engineers don't know about these things. And for them, it's like, yeah, I don't know, there is some impact, let's see. But what is really, really bad and what is like, okay, yeah, it's a trade-off. So I think this is where you could really provide quite a lot of impact, and your insights would be very, very helpful.
Great, thank you both.
Sinead, do you want to go ahead with your question?
Yep, thank you. Thank you, Vasilios and Eline, for the presentations. It's really interesting. My name is Sinead Lockwood and I work with Birdwatch Ireland. I just had a question on the kind of already existing legal requirements in different countries. Eline, when you mentioned about the avoiding and mitigation segments of the hierarchy, and I just wondered, and it could be a question for everyone on the call, are there any other countries or examples of countries that have gone beyond, let's say, the birds and habitats directives to implement those kinds of legal protections or anything kind of related to that? Thanks.
Good question. I'm also really curious. Let's see if someone in the room would want to respond to you.
Is there anyone that has a response to Sinead's question, or indeed another question?
And I can give you just a short response, because I think it's very a good thing that you mentioned, and I think it's we should split it in between above water and below water, because it's we see that for above water it's quite difficult to go that step beyond, and below the surface it can be, well, it's still difficult, but can be a little bit simpler, and that's something that really well, for us is a difference between the two, and to go towards restoring and offsetting, it's easier to do below the water surface.
Thanks, Eline. And Sinead, maybe you want to put your question in the chat, and if people have some information they want to share later in the webinar, they can do so.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions from the audience? If not, then I have another question, and it's mainly aimed at Vasily. So Eline, in her presentation, I think asked a very interesting question about whether we need ecological tender criteria and whether a better approach may be for all developers to pay a set amount into a fund that is then used for nature. And I was just wondering, from your perspective, whether you have any thoughts about this. Are there particular benefits of doing it through a tender procedure? I'm thinking not from the technical point of view, but more the tender procedure process.
I would rather say I quite like the idea, because it makes the tender procedure easier. It's of course it makes the bids more expensive. That's clear. They will, because if they have to give this levy, they will include it in their bids, the bidders. But at least you don't have, because you shouldn't forget all the administrative effort if you get the different bids, the different proposals, the different ideas, you have to evaluate them. I talked about this non-transparency and so on and so forth. From a tender perspective, I would say it's much more favorable to just ask them for a levy. Like, okay, this is like the environmental levy. If you want to build here, that's up to you. You could even make it like there are already the approaches where even in the Netherlands, where bidders submit bids for the concession of more or less it's a seabed lease. For the seabed lease, you could take part of that and put it in environmental protection actions. The only downside I see, or what is up to discussion, is the question: is the government better at finding solutions, environmental friendly, innovative solutions, than the market? That would be questioned back to Eline or to the whole floor. I think that's crucial. If it makes more sense to leave it up to the market, to the project developers to find really cool solutions to protect the environment in their offshore wind farm, or is the money better spent by the government for these environmental protection activities?
Can I respond to that? Because I think it's a good point, and I also think that it doesn't have to be an either or. It might be a combination of both. And then, for example, it would be nice to have what we now have, the tender criteria encompassing the assets, and then having a flat levy for more of the offsetting part, so more of a holistic view, also outside of your wind farm, and having the best of both worlds, so to say.
Thank you both. This is a really interesting response, and I assume it depends how the fund is then ultimately used by the government, who's involved in making the decisions about how it's used. But yeah, pretty interesting to get your views on this. So we still have time for maybe a question or two more, if there's any questions from the audience. Okay, doesn't look like it. If you have a question later, you can share it in the chat, and we'll endeavor to get back to you with an answer after the webinar or during the webinar. So now we can go for the break, and we will come back at 11:30. So you have 25 minutes of break. I suggest you stay connected and just turn off the camera, and we will see you back in 25 minutes. Thanks, everyone. Okay, great. It seems that most people are back. So we're now going to pass to the next session, which is on nature inclusive design and co-use of offshore wind farms. And I'm going to pass straight back to Eline, who's going to be talking to us about nature inclusive design. So Eline, please take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm talking quite a lot today, so bear with me. Yeah, so now I'll go into nature inclusive design a little bit of offshore wind farms, and also the benefits and limitation of nature inclusive design. Let's start with who I am and who we are. Of course, I already introduced myself, but I work for the North Sea Foundation, and especially for the Rich North Sea program. And the Rich North Sea program is a program that falls under two mother organizations, so the North Sea Foundation and the Dutch Nature and Environment Foundation. And the Rich North Sea has as goal to have all new offshore wind farms be as nature inclusive as possible, because offshore wind farms in themselves already offer an opportunity for nature to develop without other human activity, and we think that we can enhance that even further to really create a win-win both for nature and the industry, and that's why we partnered up. Here on this slide you see many of our partners with which we work together, and we started actually learning by doing. So we have 5 offshore projects right now, excuse me, right now where we have projects running with nature enhancement in offshore wind farms, and this varies from putting out oyster broodstocks to artificial reefs to nature inclusive designs. We started in 2019, and this year will be the last year unfortunately, of our program. So what is nature inclusive design? Shortly, we call it NID, and it's an integrated or added design to infrastructure. It can fall under your permit or it can be added later. And here on this picture, you see some examples. So it can be either artificial reefs or optimized scour protection. It can be on your cable crossings or even around your platform. And mostly we see nature inclusive design underwater. And it can have different target species, such as, for example, cod and lobster or flat oyster or other benthic communities. For today, I will be using this definition, which comes from Annemiek Hermans. Options that can be integrated in or added to the design of offshore infrastructure to create suitable habitat for native species whose natural habitat has been degraded or reduced. And I think this is really the case for many sea basins right now. And what we see with offshore wind is that because of the design, because of, for example, the scour protection, it really offers a nice opportunity for suitable hard substrate habitats to develop. So why use wind farms? Of course, because of the opportunities I just sketched, but also because they are quite large areas. And in most cases, there aren't a lot of other activities, such as bottom disturbance. I know this is not the case for all offshore wind farms, but in most it actually is. It's also the newest player in the field, of course, and we really have a giant need for change and for speed. So why not use this opportunity of offshore wind to also give a boost to the nature transition right now? Also, I really want to encourage you not to only limit to wind farms. Right now, it might be the most opportunistic one because it's a new player in the field, but there still are quite a lot of other activities in the offshore area as well. And why not give them a boost through nature inclusive design as well? Why? Of course, I already showed you this picture in my previous presentation. We really want to tip the scale. So less impact and a healthier system is really what we want to go towards. This is something that I really want to add to this story. Mitigation is not necessarily nature inclusive design. Because we think nature inclusive design should always enhance ecological functioning. This can be for a species or a species group or maybe even a habitat. But avoiding or minimizing, so mitigating, is not enhancing an ecological function. You're just minimizing an effect. And I think this is a really important difference to be aware of. So if we're talking about nature inclusive design, we're really talking about enhancing ecological functioning and not minimizing a negative effect. With this being said, there's really uncountable ways to enhance ecological functioning. So be creative, but also be critical. So how would this work? We start with zooming out a little bit. We want to enhance ecological functioning, but how do we want to do it? Well, there's many things we can focus on and see how we can actually help nature to become better than it currently is. And the starting point can be your current environmental status. For example, how are habitats doing? Are species declining? What are the pressures in the area? There's already a lot of tools available. There's legislation. So look at this. Look at the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, for example. Look at the specific pressures and the specific environmental status of the area. Also use other legislation such as OSPAR, but you can also use tools such as EMODnet, for example. And I think in this first step, it's really important to have a bigger picture. So zoom out as far as possible, look at sea basin scale, and see, well, what's going on in this area, and have a feeling really of the status of where your wind farm will be located. Then you can zoom in a little bit, because not every part of the sea basin, of course, is the same. Look at your area and what it used to be. Did it decline in biology? Did it use incline? Is it very different now from what it was before? So, for example, in the Dutch part of the North Sea, we used to have quite a lot of hard substrate reefs, shellfish reefs, and they declined drastically to the point where they're not there anymore. And this is really a nice way to look at the area and say, okay, right now, this might not be how we would want it to be. Having a baseline is not necessarily how it is right now. Also look to your future. How do you want it to be? What's your vision? What's your future vision? How do you want your area to look in 10 years, 30 years, or maybe even after your wind farm has been decommissioned? And also look at what's available already, what data is available. Because usually there's already monitoring going on, maybe for different purposes, but that doesn't mean the data is useless for your purpose. And then it's time to look at the design. Of course, when designing a nature inclusive asset, it's very important to first look at your rules and regulations that you're working with. Sometimes, for example, safety rules can be quite strict, so we have to adjust our process to that. Keep zooming in and out, because accumulating effects are still, they can get quite high, and we would like to affect, as large an area as possible. And to affect a large area, you also want to standardize where possible. But nature also really likes variation. So standardize, but keep your variation in the process. Try to involve all the heights of your assets. Of course, our focus is mainly underwater. But underwater, there's still a lot of different heights to your assets that you can use. So higher up in the water column, it's a totally different situation from lower down to the surface. And this is also where you can play around a little bit, where you can focus on different species, focus on different parts of the habitat, and see what would be useful for your vision. Make use of what you already have. So if you know it's going to be a wind farm with scour protection, for example, see how you can optimize that design. So can I optimize the scour protection to habitate more species? Maybe I can do something with the foundation to make it a little bit more interesting. So really look at what you already have and work with that. Of course, right now there's a lot going on in wind farms, and we have a lot of ambition. And we think that multi-use should only be allowed if it can be beneficial for nature. So, for example, if we're looking at mariculture or aquaculture, we wouldn't say, okay, let's not do it altogether, but let's do it in such a way that it is nature inclusive, so beneficial for both the industry and nature. Be innovative, be creative, of course, this is very important. And we already talked about the tender criteria, of course. And I think non-price tender criteria can really help in boosting this innovation and this creative process. So some examples here. I have a very nice map from a study from Hermans and Van Rees from 2022 from the Netherlands. And on this map, you see different species modeled. This is modeling data, but also look at monitoring data, of course. And what you see here are very nice areas. So for example, here the blue area, I don't know if you can actually see my mouse, but to the north, it's a flat oyster area where flat oyster would probably thrive. And then we have two different types of sandworms, so sand mason worm and, sorry, I don't know the English, the other term from the top of my head, so Lanice and Sabellaria. And you can see that they really have quite a distinct pattern. So if you would zoom in on one of the wind farm areas, then it's already quite clear what species would be nice to focus on and what species would maybe have a lower chance to develop there. So make use of the data which is already available. So for example, in the Netherlands, it would be MONS data. In the UK, it could be, for example, the One Bentic database, where there's also nice monitoring and modeling data available. EMODnet I also already mentioned. And it's very important to really go case for case because parameters are different in every area. So on this map, you actually see the Dutch part of the North Sea and the wind farms that are already there or that are going to be there in the near future. And the stars are where we as the Rich North Sea have our projects running right now. And I'll also show you some other examples of nature-inclusive designs. So this is one example, it's from Van Oort, and it's where they adjust the scour protection so that it can house more species. And this is quite a simple approach where the scour protection, which is already there or which has to be built anyways, is adjusted in size and structure. So it becomes more attractive to a lot of different species. Another example is to actually add assets underwater. This is from the North Sea farmers. They call it an eco-anchor. And it's really a nature-inclusive design of an anchoring system, where the anchoring system also becomes an artificial reef. And this is quite a clever design where it's nice to see you can really combine your designs and have a multi-function to it. Then additions to asset above water, I put some question marks behind it because this is always quite a difficult one. Of course, I'm talking to a lot of people who have a lot of knowledge about birds. I don't. My specialty really is underwater. So I think you should also say if this is possible or not. But as an example, here is a picture from Tenet. So that's the Dutch TSO. And they also have an option for resting platforms for birds, for excuse me, for example, on their platforms. If this is a good idea and if it's an actual addition to ecological functioning, I think this is really a discussion we should have later. But at least it's an option. And then the last one as an example is to introduce source populations. So think about the map that I just saw where you could see the potential for several different species. Not all species have the capability of spreading as far and as fast as we would like them to see. So sometimes it's needed to introduce a source population. So in this case, it's European flat oysters, so native oysters, which would we really would want to bring back to certain parts of the offshore habitat. And using such a structure can really help in creating a new broodstock, creating a new population of native oysters. So what are the benefits of nature-inclusive designs? Of course, the most obvious benefit is the benefits for nature. We really want to help the nature transition, and this is a really nice opportunity for combining both the energy transition and the nature transition. It's scalable because of the fast and the large rollout of offshore wind. It's easy to be hooked on, and if you have a design which is easy to use, then it's quite well, it would be a natural process to just see that in all new wind farms. There's an opportunity for sharing costs, for example. So if a wind park is being installed, then maybe shipping time can be shared, installation vessels can be shared. And also later when the installation is done, maybe monitoring can be done inside a wind farm while combining your vessels or other opportunities. Of course, we already talked about this. So linking to the tendering procedure and having non-price criteria, but it could also be linked to other legislation. So for example, there might already be obligations in the site decision or later on in monitoring procedures. And of course, making use of what's already there. So no other activities are allowed in a wind farm, mostly. The scour protection can be very beneficial, etc. And lastly, of course, the European is now looking at quite a high percentage of protected areas in the offshore area. Maybe wind farms can be used in time as other effective conservation methods, so OECMs. And maybe we could even create a spillover effect where nature is thriving inside a wind farm. Maybe fish species, for example, are doing really good, and there will be a spillover effect into other areas and other industries, such as fishing industries, for example. Of course, I'm not saying you should fish out everything that you're making inside one of these parks, but it could be an effect on the long term. There are, of course, also limitations to nature-inclusive designs. And the first one is that most of the areas that we work with, especially wind farms, are chosen to have the least effect on nature. So these areas might not be the best areas to actually enhance nature or restore nature. If you're working on a human structure or a design, then it's fairly certain that at some point in time it has to be taken out again. And that's also something we really have to be very critical about when looking at nature-inclusive designs. If it has to be taken out, will you delete your entire work, or will it still be beneficial, even in the time that it's there? Right now, in European waters, we have no unblemished areas. It's quite difficult to go somewhere and to say, okay, human hands haven't touched this part of the sea yet. And that's what we have to work with. But it also makes it difficult because we have no clear baseline. Human activities are inevitable, so we really have to work with that. And that also gives us the pressure for multi-use areas. And this can be beneficial, but it can also be a limitation. Because, for example, if you're dividing a wind farm area into different areas of use, you can have a nature area on one side and maybe passive fisheries on the other. And that's where it could start to rub against each other. And we don't want that. Also, there's a sort of risk where we say, okay, these areas are doing so well, they might be replacing marine protected areas, and that's something we definitely don't want. We want this to be an addition to give nature an extra boost, but we don't want it to be replacing actual protected areas, of course. And this is also a difficult one. Sometimes we're creating nature in areas where it wasn't there before, or a different type of ecology, a different type of habitat. And it's always difficult to decide on something like that. Are we actually affecting the intrinsic nature of a habitat? So for example, we're putting hard substrate in a sandy habitat. It might attract a whole lot of species and biodiversity might go up. But is this something that we want in an area that's naturally, well, sandy? And of course, there's quite a lot of practical limitations to nature-inclusive designs. There's a lot of rules and regulations we have to work with. Costs can be incredibly high. There's always insurances you have to work with, responsibilities, and just the practicalities of it can be quite difficult. And in the end, there's a lot we don't know yet. So proof of concept still is missing in a lot of cases. Of course, science is trying to keep up, but habitats and ecology just take quite a long time to develop. So having hard proof of concept is quite difficult on the short term. So in the end, we have to speed up, but don't forget about mitigating if you're looking at nature enhancement. And this is also what we talked about earlier during the non-price criteria session. So look at extra legal options above your mitigation actions. Look at offsetting as well. This might not be possible in the wind farm, it might be possible outside of your wind farm. So have more of a holistic view on this. Don't forget about monitoring, of course. Before, after control and impact monitoring would, of course, be the best. It's not always possible, but keep this in mind. And research opportunities are always very valuable. And last but not least, keep exchanging our knowledge because we are all learning. And we really want to share what we've learned with each other and keep on learning by doing as well. Here are some helpful links. I'm sure the presentation will be shared later on, so I will not go into these, but these are quite nice reads if you want to learn more about this. And thank you very much again for your attention.
Thank you, Eline, for the presentation and the really nice overview. Just to pick up on one of the points you mentioned about decommissioning and what happens to this nature-inclusive design when you come to decommission your wind farm. So we will have a session on this during the webinar next week. So we'll hopefully explore this in a bit more detail. And so now I open the floor for any questions. Anyone have a question or comment? So Anna, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ana Almeida, working as a Marine Conservation Officer at SPEA in Portugal. Thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. My question is related with the technology, because here in Portugal, we are now looking at go-to areas, and we have a predicted auction to happen in October this year. And from what we know, all the projects, or almost all of them, are intended to be floating turbines. So as you didn't mention, do you know if there's anything with this nature design for that technology? And also, of course, I'm really interested to know from the others, other examples of measures for birds, such as the one, as you mentioned, the platforms. But I've heard about black blades for birds. I don't know if I'm new in this area. I work with fisheries and bycatch. So just for curiosity, if anyone in the audience knows more about this. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I'll go for the first one, and then maybe someone from the audience can answer your question about the black blades. Of course, as the North Sea Foundation, our focus is the North Sea, which is too shallow to have floating wind turbines. But we have been thinking about this, and things that came to mind, of course, are, for example, an eco anchor, like the one I showed before, because they have to be anchored to the sea somehow. And having an eco anchor is quite a nice opportunity. Of course, really depending on the depth and what type of habitat you find there. And you can adjust it then to the needs that are right there. And then you also have the tether, so tethering the turbine to the anchor, and this could also be used. So, for example, we see a lot of mussel growth on tethers the further you go up in the water column, and this could also be used in a nature inclusive way. So either you would want more mussels there and maybe create a nice opportunity maybe as food for other species, but also as a base if they fall off for reefs, for example. And you can play around with that, with different materials, with floats, with ropes, with chains and things like that, to make it either more interesting for certain species or less attractive to other species. And it's really looking at, well, what do you have, what do you want, and what's available in that area, and play around with that. And I also think that when looking at different designs and new ways of including those designs, it's always interesting to have different options and monitor those. So look at different types of material, for example, different sizes, different textures, and see what works and what doesn't. I hope that helps a little bit.
Thank you. David?
Hi, I have a question which is not really project specific, and it's almost kind of philosophical and more legal. And that's, so here we have the renewable energy sector coming into the marine environment as a new player, and coming into sadly a very degraded marine environment in most of European waters. And my question is if in the debates so far in the areas where the sector is most advanced, so for example, in the Northern Baltic Seas, how far are debates looking at whether renewables should solve problems created by other sectors? So already created by the fossil fuel sector, already created by marine transport, already created by, of course, fishing, or by tourism pressure, etc. So I think there's a kind of a tendency of the environment sector and interests to look to this new player as a great source of funding. But I think there's a risk that takes us away from the obligations of other policies to do their job properly, and of national governments to be doing their jobs properly. So national governments need to be protecting biodiversity, and they're not. They need to be preventing pollution, and they're not. And they should be doing this with their sectoral policies at European and national level, and they're not. So I wonder how far in the renewable sector are they kind of saying, well, why should we solve the problems created by others?
I think it's a very good one, and it might also be a nice one to discuss a little bit in the room as well, because I don't have all the answers. But I can give a little bit of a discussion starter. I think it's a really good point. And it's also the question of who is responsible, right? Are we all responsible as a society for the actions of our ancestors? And personally, I think, yes, we are all responsible. So we now all have a responsibility to make it better. And what I see in the development of the offshore industries is that this responsibility or the feeling of responsibility is growing as well. 10 years ago, if we would say, well, you need to do something for ecology when building your wind farm, they would say, no, that's not our responsibility. We're just building a wind farm and we're doing something great for the world because it's renewable energy. And maybe ecology would be the last thing they would think of, and it had to be cheap and it had to be, easy. And that's definitely shifting. So we're really seeing a change in how large industries are looking at ecology. And I think it's a combination of obligation, of course, just legal obligation, but also, more of a holistic view in saying, okay, we cannot take from the sea forever. We have to give something back as well. And of course, our whole legal system is not made for that. And we really have to, well, take steps in adjusting it. And that's difficult because it's easy to tackle offshore wind because it's the new one, it's a new player. And we're still building our legal framework around it. While, for example, for oil and gas and fisheries is already in place. And it's very difficult to adjust and enhance it in such a way that's acceptable for both the industry and for society in general. But maybe someone else would like to chip in as well.
Is there anyone else that would like to add to Eline's answer? If not, we can move to the next question. So we have Pierre-Yves who has the hand up.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm working in WWF France, so based in south of France, so more interested in the Mediterranean projects. And I have a question regarding the difference you make between mitigation and nature inclusive design, since from the point of view of the state, it's not clear. We have no guidelines. And so sometimes they will sell something as nature inclusive design, but it's all just mitigation measures at the end. And it's very difficult for us to sensitize the operators and the state to bring the reality of what we call in France eco-design. It means designing, thinking with nature, which means that you start from scratch, thinking about nature when you're designing the technology. For us, we have scientists in France. They're trying to address this, and you use one picture from one of them, Mr. Pioche, with this beautiful turbine with lots of different things around, which means that you have to think all from scratch with nature. And but it's really difficult at the end for the operators to have this because it changed everything. They are not used to do so. So it's like the engineer are working on the technology, and at the end, they will try to integrate nature at the really end, which is mitigation. This is not nature inclusive design. This is all mitigation. Nature inclusive design, it's starting with and for nature, building the technology, which means innovation, which means lots of things. And it seems that no one is aware of it, and we are trying to work with the state, also try to sensitize the state and the let's say the people in charge of evaluation of the authorization. So have people from the state also work on the environmental impact assessments to validate or invalidate the nature impact assessment for approval of the project. Those people have no idea of what means nature inclusive design. So usually they'll take the impact assessment with no clue of what is and what is not, which makes it's a really hard time for NGOs trying to continue to explain what is the main difference. And there is a main issue.
Yes, I totally hear you. And I think this is, I'm lucky that in the Netherlands, we're making huge steps in this, but I'm also very aware that this is not the case in every country. And also in the Netherlands, there's so many steps we still have to take, but that's also, I think, our job, our role as NGOs, to keep on pushing the necessity of eco-design, of thinking from nature, of having nature as your baseline, not having industry as your baseline. And I think it's getting better, but it's a process, and it doesn't sometimes go as fast as we would like, I think, especially as NGOs. But I think there is progress, so we have to really hold on to that and keep on, kicking in the door, so to say, and really well, point out the obvious benefits that it has for both the industry and legislation and nature. So yeah, I hear you, but keep on doing what you're doing, and hopefully we'll get there at some point.
Are there any more questions from the audience? Okay, I don't see any hands up. Maybe before we move on, I can quickly pick up on one of the points, which was about the bird perches that you mentioned. And I think this is a really relevant point when we talk about nature inclusive design, is whether what we're doing is actually enhancing ecological function. And I think maybe these bird perches is quite a good example of something where it, in our opinion, is probably not enhancing ecological function. I mean, birds do not have natural perches in the middle of the